and welcome to today's session of the Digital Art Observatory project. I'm very glad that today we have such an important topic as analytics and analysis of the cultural data in your own artistic practice. And I'm more than happy to present our today's speaker, Anders Petterson. He does not even need an introduction as one of the leading person in the sphere of art analytics globally. So Anders, the floor is yours. Please introduce yourself and tell us about the topic you will be covering today.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Anastasia, and thanks for inviting me to this. It's not that often I manage to talk about, I guess, data and what we do in this sense. Normally we talk about the end results of what we're doing. So I'm quite excited about at least to talk about some of the big topics and the challenges that we are facing as an industry. And hopefully some of these might relate to your own practice and maybe what you want to do later on. So I wanted to kind of maybe do this over kind of a 30 minutes and leave enough space for questions at the end. If that means that you also wanted to ask questions throughout, please feel free to do so. I'm just going to share my presentation and we'll get started. Okay, can everyone see the first slide roughly?
Yes, it works perfectly. Yeah.
Great, excellent. So my name is Anders Petterson, and I'm the founder of ArtTactic. So we actually celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, which is kind of, I guess, from the sort of an art market point of view, we're in an early, one of the early generation of
Sorry,
art.
because I need to join this call, but now I'm use some special equipment, and you didn't hear you.
Саша, выключи звук, тобой чутно.
Yeah, sorry for a quick interruption. I will be muting everybody for now. Kind of, it's incidentally not turned off the microphone. We will have a separate kind of question Q&A session at the end. And if you have anything you would like to say, please put it in the message box in the chat.
Perfect. Okay, so where was I? I was roughly where I was 20 years ago. So as I said, we were probably one of the first generation of art market research and analytics, I guess it's companies that focused on data in the art world. And we've been running this for a long period of time, and obviously seen the evolution of the importance or maybe lack of importance of data in the art world and the art market. So I mostly, when we deal with data and research, is from the market point of view, not necessarily the commercial aspect of we don't think about the art market necessarily as only the commercial transactions. We think about the art market as an ecosystem of participants, both from the creators to the public sector to the private sector and everything in between. And now also increasingly I guess the sort of the collaborations and relationships that the art market has forced with other professional industries outside the domain of art. So that might be the link between the art and the finance industry, the art and the tech industry. And we're always very interested in that intersection when these things collide or these things are starting to, the interest starts to emerge. And our task over the years has really been to try to discover and uncover and data that will allow for better decision making, and maybe to bring to light some of the kind of issues and challenges that individual markets are facing. And so we're using it really, as I said, as to inform decision. That was always our starting point. So over the years we have kind of focused on a number of areas, as I said. These intersections between tech and online is a ongoing partnership that we have with Hiscox, which has really been looking at the evolution around online or the e-commerce aspect of art. Obviously, this has now merged and morphed into another kind of digital space, which is around digital collectibles and NFTs, which we started also to, I would say, in its infancy in terms of us trying to understand the market itself, but also the ramification of this on the traditional art world. The Art and Finance report is something that we're publishing the next edition of this on the 25th of October. Just an announcement has been made today that there will be a presentation of the report. And this is a partnership that is now exactly 10 years old, and we have been working with Deloitte since 2011. So all these things are, I would say, important partnerships, and has also helped, I think, a lot of industries and a lot of companies that are relying on information either for fundraising purposes or for strategy purposes, are needing this kind of thing of having industry research. Most other industries has this, whether you are in the telecom sector or in the consumer goods sector. There are a number of people that are out there who's looking at consumer trends and publishing this for the purpose. But in the art world, this is really we're still, I would say, one of the few that are focusing particularly on this particular topic. Now, so why did we choose art market data? So on my background, I started off in finance. I studied economics. I went into banking in the 90s and used to work for JP Morgan for 6 years, and decided that I wanted to do something that was related to what the banking industry was doing, which was the way they used analytics and the way they used data to communicate, to increase transparency in the market, to bring more people into the market, etc. And I thought, okay, maybe this is a way that I can bring in my former colleagues into the art world. What about if I give them data and tools that look similar in its visual language to the kind of tools that they are used to when they are in the finance world. So my starting point was really this whole thing about increasing market transparency, making it somehow, the kind of, I guess, the impact we have had is probably minimal. There's so many other things that has made the art market more transparent, although we are far from a point where we can say that the art market is a total transparent marketplace, but it's becoming more transparent. And I like to think that we are being part of that wave, a small part of a bigger wave that's been driven by many things. And the other thing in terms for us is, and where most of the research that we're doing and the data that is being used for, is really to have what we call kind of evidence-based decision-making, in the sense that, we don't make decisions purely on a hunch. We don't make decisions on the basis of a feeling or emotion. But you can imagine those kind of evidence-based decision-making in the art world was a really, really hard sell. To try to sell to a collector that he was going to try to make a decision on something that he was emotionally attached to. He saw an artwork or an artist that he falls in, or she falls in love with, and then basically, the decision was predominantly emotional. Obviously, there was a financial underpinning, and there was a financial decision part of it, but to have an external, independent, kind of objective data that might basically prove that, or might not necessarily prove, but might say something that is contrary to that feeling of, I would say that attachment was often kind of counterintuitive, which meant that basically the art world never really made decisions on the basis of data. And this is something we realized this very quickly on in our evolution as a company, that we're never going to make money out of collectors. Collectors are making decisions, and it's like, at least the early generation of collectors are making decisions on more irrational grounds, and that's fine. We're not making a judgment whether that's good or bad, but for us as a business, that wasn't really the place where we're going to start to make any inroads. So we started to increasingly look at the outside, all the various industries and the various services that was looking at the art market as a potential marketplace to develop their own space, whether that's from an insurance or tech or finance point of view. And in most of these decisions, there were companies that were used to make any decision based on facts and data, and obviously having to put this in front of a board to make sure, simply to use kind of nicely fluffy words about how great this thing doesn't really work in a corporate environment. So a lot of the kind of data that we have been producing and the research that we've been doing over the last 20 years has kind of increasingly become more, I would say, of industrial character. When I say industrial, meaning more directed towards services and industries outside the art world. Now, we have seen, and particularly in the last 5 years, an increasing interest in data, also on a consumer level. The amount of people that we are seeing coming through over either educational initiatives or through our research products and buying into memberships, etc., have increased significantly, and the target group is much younger and more globally diverse. We're seeing more buying of research from Asia and so forth. So I think, generally the market is changing. And this sort of focus that we used to have, as I said, on the industry, I think is now we're starting to see that there is just generally an appetite for data analytics and just some kind of objective, or at least an objective in a sort of quotation mark, look at a particular issue or a particular market or an artist or whatever the data is trying to portray. Now, I guess the part of this, as I said, the journey in for us was obviously combining this with learning and education to kind of create a place where we could trust, where there is more trust, and we believe that through more trust we can get more participation, and through that we can get bigger market. And bigger market, again, I'm not talking about necessarily a commercial market. I'm talking bigger market in a bigger ecosystem, supported both non-commercial as well as commercial entities. I have a bigger place, a bigger marketplace for more people to participate. And the art world, as we know, has been relatively insular up until 18 months ago when it comes to the pandemic and the impact it had on the digital transformation that we've seen in the art world. The amount of I would say migration towards the digital, whether that's online online selling or online e-commerce, or the use of social media, the interest now in blockchain, the interest in NFTs, all of these things has happened within a relatively short space of time. And I think, really what's happening now is that I think we are at the sort of cusp of a kind of a pivotal moment in at least 20 years that we have been observing. We have never seen so much change and so much innovation and so much kind of acceptance within the art world of the innovation taking place. I think in the past, there's been a lot of reluctance to embrace new things. People don't want to change. And I think we have just all of us in the personal capacity and professional capacities have had to adapt to the environment that we all have been going through over the last 18 months now. So I think, interestingly enough, my look at the history and the past, I think we're moving into something quite exciting. And I think, from a data point of view, hopefully, like in other markets, I think data will have a real value. But there are issues, and I think the issues we are dealing with in general is there's probably three things for us. One is the trust in the data, and then is the access to the data and what kind of data makes sense in terms of actually collecting and gathering this data. And then the final thing, which maybe sounds obvious, but it's also how do we monetize this data? How do we know, how can we create the need for the data? And I think this is one of the issues we're dealing with the art market, is that we're dealing with a relatively low literacy when it comes to data literacy, in the sense that even the kind of the want and the need often, as I mentioned earlier, conflicts with the more irrational, the more passion, the more emotional. And not everyone's going to have their financial mind on when they make decisions, and therefore data doesn't always make sense when it comes to transacting in the art world. But I think data in general, as I said, for us, data is not only about buying and selling art. It's obviously everything that goes on in the art world that we can collect footprints of various actors in these markets, and how we can aggregate and make sense of that data. That's really what we're here for. So in terms of trust, I think it's kind of interesting because this is problematic. I mean, it's problematic because if there is a lack of trust in art market data. So this is a kind of this is a survey we did with Deloitte 2 years ago for the last Art Finance Report, where we asked art professionals, collectors, and wealth managers about the level of trust they had in art market data. So these are the respondents who said that they had a very high or very high level of trust. Now, if you look at wealth managers, then this basically means that 84% of wealth managers had a kind of medium to low level of trust in data. Slightly less with collectors, with 70% and 69% of art professionals having a low level of trust. Now, what does this mean? Low level of trust. Does that mean that they don't think the quality of the data is good? I mean, in the sense that there's mistakes, is it that kind of thing that we're talking about? or is it something slightly more profound than that? And I think if we combine that with other findings that we have done through other research and also with Deloitte, is that the reason why people feel that there's a sort of sense of mistrust in the, I guess, in the data, is linked to a broader issue of a mistrust in how the art market operates. So things like lack of transparency, price manipulation, conflict of interest, insider dealing, all these kind of things are ultimately practices that is being conducted in the art world, which ultimately the footprints of these transactions then is a replica of behavioral aspects in the art world that the outside, I would say the outside people outside, including collectors and art professionals, are looking at this and say, listen, we don't trust the data, partly because we don't trust the way that the industry is behaving. And therefore, that this is problematic, because how do we rectify this? How do we find, how do we get to a point where we can trust the data? Because, I mean, in the sense, the raw data is what it is. The problem is if you took, for example, an auction price, people might say, well, yes, it's sold for this, but that was, a price that is not real. There was other reasons for what that price went to 1 million, and it should have been 500,000. Now, the price, obviously, an observable data point that will go into the databases and will be replicated and used in multiple circumstances through different types of analytical tools. But if the industry somehow has a suspicion that this data underlying the reason for why these data happen in the first place are, as a result of some kind of inefficiency or potentially manipulative behavior in the art world, then obviously the whole kind of thing falls apart. And this is also when we started talking about, big data and art market data and, artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's all very interesting, and I think it's all, it's probably where things are heading. The problem, we kind of somehow deal with this thing here first. We're going to make sure that we ultimately have some kind of comfort and confidence in the data that we are using, because if we don't have that, then the raw material that's going to go into any kind of advanced analytics will ultimately suffer from the same problem, that what comes out will be suffering from the same lack of trust. And even more so, maybe because it becomes within a kind of a black box framework where no one really knows how these kind of results has come up, because algorithms and machine learning and artificial intelligence has kind of sorted this out. The biases in it, we don't know. So I think when we create an art, I guess it's starting to think about an architecture and infrastructure for using art market data for these purposes of, big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence. I think we also need to kind of just question ourselves, how do we sort out these issues first? How do we deal with issues like lack of transparency and price manipulation, all these things? And I think part of this is changing, and part of it is changing because the art world is falling under more regulation that we have seen in the past. We have seen, anti-money laundering rules are now, enforced also in the art world, impacting, virtually the entire art trade. Painful, I think, as a legislation, but I think over time would help to maybe clean up some of that kind of suspicion or that sort of reputation that the art world has. And I think sometimes this is unfairly, the art world will, there will be media articles that will talk about the art world in a sort of as some kind of a market for con men. But I think, this is, these are really only probably a few bad apples that will destroy for most of the people. So I think, but this thing with trust is really essential. And I think, this is something that we all struggle with, is that, people have these sort of slightly flippant, so I think, well, we can't trust the data, so then let's ignore it. I think this better is that let's use this data to figure out why we don't trust it, and where is it there are signs of manipulation. How can we use the data to kind of identify those things? And all these things are possible. But obviously, sometimes the market is not always also ready to listen to things. I mean, they're not necessarily ready to listen to change and want to change. So these are kind of, some of the issues. Now, part of these, I would say, this mistrust is linked to transactional data. And I think, this is where maybe we should start to think much broader. When we do research around individual artists, we don't think about transactions as, you know, the only footprint that is relevant to an individual, to understanding an individual art market or an individual artist market. It's really when we start to think about the an artist or a creator or any player within a ecosystem, is that we think about, as I said, as a market ecosystem, that each one of the players, each one of the participants and stakeholders leaves footprints behind, data, digital footprints behind them. And in a sense, the aggregation of all this data we can use for the purposes of trying to understand, you know, what is the impact of, you know, influences of certain art fairs, what are the impact of certain curatorial voices, all these things. Now, this is where I think actually, and we have already seen some companies out there. One is called Wonder.ai, a Canadian company that is gathered a lot of information that is non-transactional, but largely biographical data, looking at, you know, artists' journeys, and are using that data to kind of look at things like clusters, and looking at where, you know, are there certain, you know, points and references in the career that had a significant impact on the trajectory of the career. How much can that be relevant to other artists and so forth? So I think when we, instead of starting to be overly focused about auction data as the only source, which we know is, first of all, is limited to a relatively handful of, you know, artists that are finding themselves in an auction, is already an editing process that there, and it does far from represent everyone. Is that we start to use other data. And this is where some of you might have come across platforms like artfacts.net, for example, that's been gathering biographical information now since 2004. They now launched an app called Limna, which is a kind of a price finding app using both primary market prices, so basically gallery prices, as well as the more kind of cultural value that is associated with an artist. So this is where I think, you know, it's interesting, is when we think about data in the art world, is that we need to start to think about this in a holistic sense. Now, obviously, collecting all this data is time consuming, costly, and one needs to also think about the other end of it, is that you've got to sort of have to live off this. Is there demand for it? Is there people willing to pay for this data? And this is, I think we are not quite there yet. And therefore, some of the platforms that maybe are too early into this will struggle to find an audience that is willing to, you know, help monetizing, you know, the efforts that's made into it. But I think this holistic look, not simply looking at transaction data, but start to look at any kind of data, from social media data to you know, mainstream data to now more and more also kind of NFT based data. I think this is really you know, where the market is going. So if we think about the data sources and these footprints, we talked about transaction data, auction data, increasingly primary sales data, which was very hard to get, and still hard to get in terms of primary sales, meaning the final sale. But at least you can start to now get a better sense of pricing by the fact that more of the art is finding itself online. So the last 18 months has made the primary market much more transparent, partly as a result of online exhibitions, partly as a result of the OVRs, so the online viewing rooms that the art fairs has been launching now for the last 18 months. Now, obviously, people are going back to a bit of a normality with Art Basel happening this week. But luckily, you know, they're in a sense, with the gap that we used to have in the past is now gradually being filled by this process of you know, more and more data becoming digital. And then we have obviously this last boom of NFT data that I think also is going to be an incredibly useful and interesting development, also in terms of thinking about both prices, but also how I guess the links now between the physical artwork and also the NFTs itself. Cultural data, this is where it's really about, I would say, more looking at the stakeholders, looking at the gallery and museum activities, looking at the artist's career-related data, so biographical data. All these things can be obviously aggregated and analyzed, and particularly interestingly look at these sort of nodes in the cultural infrastructure that has influence and potentially can then decide the probabilities of an artist career entering one direction or the other. We look at traditional media data, social media data, and then also kind of crowdsourced data. And this is I would say crowdsourced data is where we are starting to, for ourselves, is to think, okay, what do we want this world to look like? Do we want machines to make the decisions, or can we use the crowds? Can we use people, humans, also as part of this process of, being a contributor to predictive analytics and other things? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end, and what we're doing in that particular space. Now, this thing between big data and small data, I mean, everyone talk about big data. But I think in the art world, I think we have to ask the question, does big equal useful? And I think, sometimes if you think about the art world, as I said, it's a very fragmented art marketplace. The data is very fragmented. The pools of data is relatively shallow and relatively small. And obviously we know that big data is, it's amazing, I guess, using artificial intelligence, machine learning to kind of find correlations in, unstructured and structured data. But small data is really about, I guess, finding causation. And I think this is what we tend to do when we work with data, is that, we might deal with a lot of data, but often we deal with very small, but often very valuable and informative data sets, which allows us to make real actions or make real call to actions. And I think, these things in the art world, might suffer from maybe just jumping onto this big data thing because investors and the market might think this is the biggest thing, but I'm just not sure if this really is the right way for the art world to go. And actually that, the value, I think, sits much more deeper and often granular into smaller data sets that can often reveal a lot more. And I think this is something that's bear in mind, that we're not necessarily copying what other industries are doing, but trying to maybe adapt some of the methodologies and technologies that is available to the market that we're in, which is a very, still, even if it's a global marketplace and increasingly a global industry, it's still a very specific and highly complex market when it comes to using data, I would say, for decision-making purposes. So the monetization bit is obviously, I guess, having been 20 years doing what we're doing and having lived off only producing data. So we don't buy, we don't sell, we don't make commissions. We purely charge for the work we do when it comes to data. I think there's a few lessons learned from this. I mean, first of all, as I mentioned, I think there's been a very low data literacy in the art market. Meaning, when I say data literacy, first of all, it's an understanding of the data and what it can be used for, but it is also, I think, as I mentioned earlier, lack of appetite for actually having data there. It was for many in the art world, I think, too blunt, too upfront, too obvious, to something that was in their face, which kind of contradicted maybe their perception about what the world actually looked like. So I think there was often that data often was counterintuitive, maybe also to the argument that galleries and dealers would use when they were talking about the specific artist. What we have seen over the last, particularly, as I said, over the last 5 years, is that clients are increasingly asking both galleries and dealers and art advisors to provide them not only with the historic and the cultural and the aesthetic aspects of an artwork, but also the market aspect. Where are we in terms, what is the data telling us? Where are the risks and where are the opportunities? So I think we are, partly because this growth of art as an asset class, the entire move where art is not simply purely an aesthetic or cultural or a historic object, but is increasingly also finding itself into the financial space. Data is starting to become in a very important part of decision making. Now, as I said earlier, there are issues with this data, and there's an issue with the trust, and we got to make sure that we kind of sort these things out before a lot of people jumps on into this market for investment purposes, are misled by data. Now, this links a little bit to what, as I said, we need to also make sure that we educate people, make them understand how the market works, what the rules of the market are, I mean, we often describe the art market as a game, and when you play a game, you've got to make sure who do you know are the other participants, what strategies are they playing, and what are the rules of this game. And I think that a lot of people are jumping in maybe naively into this market with very little background and understanding of the mechanics of the market. And I think, again, we've been educating as well as producing and gathering and collecting data for 15 years, and those two for us goes very much hand in hand. And as I said, also the low literacy combined with the fact that data is not part of most people's decision-making process. And a lot of people in the art world still are making decisions based on relationships and a council of advisors that people they trust. And it's fine. I mean, I don't think that's a problem. The problem with this is that I think you will never grow a market beyond what it is if you have this model. I mean, transparency is ultimately the only way we can expand the marketplace. For some people, there's no incentive to expand the marketplace. They want to maybe stay as they are. They're very comfortable as they are. And I think this was also one of the main reasons why we really never saw a proper, embracement of online, 2-3 years ago. It was through the sheer, being forced by the COVID-19 pandemic that the art world had to adapt to technology in a much more committed way than they've done in the past. And I think the same thing is likely to happen with data over time. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but bit by bit, people will start to use data as part of the decision making. Free data is problematic, obviously great for the consumer, but it makes it really hard to differentiate, I think, quality. And I think free data, there's also, as we know, with social media tools and Facebook and all these things, when you give something away for free, there's also, there's no free lunch out there. There's something else at the back of it. And I think we suffer from generally a market where there's mistrust. If you have information that is often bundled in with commerce, I think ultimately you're starting to reduce the objectivity of that information. The problem yet, I don't think that consumers are ready to make that decision and be willing to pay for something, partly again coming back to the thing that it's difficult for them to decipher what is good quality research or what is good quality data and what isn't. And I think quality for me sometimes not necessarily the actual physical data and raw data that's going into it. I think sometimes it's the reason why you produced it in the first place. Do you have a vested interest in saying something here, or are you observing? And the role that we've been taking for the last 20 years is an observer. We're not in the market to influence the market. We don't have any vested interest. We don't buy, we don't sell, as I said. And that's maybe the only way we can start to sort of, be neutral. That doesn't mean we're not susceptible to people who might want to kind of manipulate or our understanding of a particular market, but hopefully through the means of talking to a number of stakeholders in the market, we can start to get a picture of how things works. The other thing is lack of competition. I mean, it's great to maybe be one of the few in the market, and you can think, well, that's great to not have a competition. You're kind of a monopoly. But actually, competition is what you need. We need a competitive marketplace for information. We should have many, ArtTactics producing reports on this and different marketplaces, so that at least when we can compare these different sources, no one's going to be perfect, and we're not perfect, and others are not perfect. But the more we at least have of different information, the more we will draw people in, and the more need we will create for information. So I think this is something that has been tricky. But again, it's also tricky because, as for the same reason that it is often very hard to live off data only and to monetize data as your only business model. Right. How are we doing for time? Okay, so I think I was sort of mentioned a little bit in the introduction regarding predictive analytics and price predictions, etc. And I think, again, we need to kind of maybe ask ourselves, do we need it? And if yes, for what purpose? I mean, predictive analytics, I think, for business planning purposes and strategy and improved decision making, I think, it's can be very useful. And I think we're probably likely to see the bigger players in the auction markets, the Sotheby's and Christie's of the world, using these things to kind of, figuring out how to maybe curate their sales or when to sell things at a certain point to sell. And I think all these things, there's going to be enough data very soon to start to kind of build up, a good picture for helping to make decision making, more smoothly and more efficiently. I think there are other things obviously around valuations and pricing and trends and patterns. And I think this is obviously there's already businesses coming into this space and looking at price predictions and valuation. And I think, in general, I think that's that's the right approach. And I think it works well for, certain parts of the market, and would obviously make it much more effective for the likes of insurance companies, for example, to adjust insurance premiums according to, an algorithm that adjusts prices rather than having a physical appraiser coming in. Now, I just still do think that this human aspect of being involved in the prediction of things are useful. And this is really what led us to the kind of a project around crowd predictions. Because first of all, I was thinking, okay, well, how do we can obviously have machines, as we mentioned very early on, doing all the job for us. But if we don't trust what's going in, it's not really going to help us in the end. What about if we can create something which educate people about the value and the market itself? We wanted to kind of create a fun and kind of competitive environment through more kind of a gamification model, and then people could basically, through feedback and learning from mistakes, become better at what they're doing. So we created a community of what we call art forecasters, and which is basically sort of crowdsourced for opinion. And we've been running this for 7 years now, in a very much in a sort of a stealth mode, in a sense that we never really put it out there to everyone. We have about 3,500 people that is registered players. Some people play, once a year, other people play every single day. But I think what the interesting for us was the attempt was really to, first of all, get people involved to understand value. I think the only way we can rectify some of the problems in the data and the problems in, not sufficient demand for the market is that we just don't have enough data literacy. So how do we deal with that? Okay, education, Sotheby's and Christie's, education and others are helping to do that. Media is helping to do that. But I also thought that here's another potential platform to do so. It will allow us, and I think this comes a little bit back to this whole the issue of wisdom of the crowd. Obviously it was a book that was published in 2004, looking at, are the crowds better at predicting outcomes than experts? I mean, I think the academic literature is slightly divided in the opinions about, whether that is the case or not. But I think from us, it was really the purpose was moving decision-making from individuals to a larger group of individuals. And where the individuals that were necessarily in part of that decision-making process were not necessarily intrinsically insiders as part of this. So the game has basically evolved in the sense that there's been players who might come from different backgrounds. They might be students, and 6 years after they are one of our top forecasters. Now, to become a top forecaster, you just need to play a lot. And some of these people has been playing probably about 20,000 predictions. If you play 20,000 forecasts, you will learn something, and that's for sure. You will just learn from your mistakes, and you're getting to sort of get a sense of how the market works. Now, this is for us, it allows us to basically create new data and new types of analytics. So we have obviously the auction data, and we have the estimates. In this case, we have the auction data estimates, and we have a forecasting distribution around this data, which allows us to look at things like the expectation of the market prior to the sale. Now, in a single event, like a single lot, that doesn't maybe mean something, but if we aggregate that data across many lots, many auctions, we could also, bring in things like confidence. We can use this group to actually pick out the forecasters that are best at certain things. So we can basically say, okay, if someone wanted to find the best forecaster for a whorl, which is a whorl with a dollar sign, for example, we can go back into the system and figure out who these best forecasters are, and they could, that skill set that they have evolved could be maybe used for something. So for us, is again simply going down the machine route in the art world. I think is likely to meet a lot of resistance from the existing marketplace. I think we can involve the existing marketplace into and enable them to use technology to make better decisions. So an appraiser using different analytical tools to help them do their jobs properly. I think that will go down well. And I think, in a sense, sometimes we need to just ask ourselves: is there really a market for data analytics? In a sort of in different packages in the art world. I mean, I think what many has realized that this is a very specific market. Yes, data analytics might grow. I think it's an absolutely essential part in all aspects in order to kind of grow this market from where it is to something else. I mean, as I said, when we think about data, it's not only about transaction data. We work with art and philanthropy. We work with galleries and thinking about their business models. I mean, all these things are data that hopefully will get the market to evolve. So I sort of, as this is just a kind of, for those of you who are interested in trying the quiz, you can just type in artforecaster.com and you can register and play for free. And as I said, it's sort of daily auction quizzes. You can predict, you have ranks, etc. And then basically there's an analytics element which allows you to kind of get real-time forecasts on live lots. So now, for example, in 4 days' time, you have the New Now Phillips sale in New York. Lots of very young artists is being put forward there. And many of the artists that we were actually part of our last Next Generation Artist Report that was published on Wednesday will be in this sale. And we have, as I said, we have created a number of sort of small, what we call quizzes, where people can then, participate. But as part of it is participation, learning, become good at something, and for us to be able to use that data later on to also help other people making decisions. So that's really a little bit run through, what some of the things that we're doing and maybe some of the issues that we're facing as an industry. So I know we're probably have a bit of time for questions. And I'm just going to have a glass of water because I'm starting to lose my voice slightly.
Anders, thank you very much for this insightful presentation.